for a while in your lives. So why not talk about it? There are some people with high hormone levels and some people with low hormone levels. Some people never reproduce, some people never get married, some people don't really care about that kind of stuff. And other people, that's their main focus, and they're just, they are looking in that direction all of their life. Why? And the answer is because it has to do with hormones. And some people will have high hormone levels and some people have low hormone levels. There's a reason why I put the tall guy in there. And it's because tall people tend to have low hormone levels, as confusing as that is. Not exactly sure why. Oh, wait a minute, I have to turn it. I have to plug this thing in. Okay. As curious as that is. Can we correlate high levels of hormones with frequent sexual response? Yes, we can. One of the problems, one of the things that happens to people as they age is that their hormone levels go down. And as their hormone levels go down, theoretically their sexual response is reduced. So, and that's one of the reasons why people think that old people don't have sex, because they have low hormone levels, and they probably shouldn't be having a lot of sex. One of the interesting things about our current president, come on, there it goes. One of the curious things about our current president is that he brags about. He talks about sexual things all the time. And that may be because he's trying to show people that he's still a viable, I mean, he's 73, 74 years old. He's still a viable individual, as curious as that is. Is that right? No, that's wrong. Okay. The human brain and its peripheral neuronal structures can change with stimulation from the environment, and it can change almost instantaneously, as curious as that is. This is known as neuroplasticity. So if you went to the fair this weekend down in Chinle, and you saw something that you'd never seen before, you'll probably remember it, and it'll probably be stuck in your brain. And the reason it's stuck in your brain is because you have created a memory, and the memory comes from neural plasticity. All you had to do was see it one time, and it changed the structure of your brain. Parts of the neurons called the dendritic spine seem to be in constant motion and can change shape in a matter of seconds. And these are what change. This is the reason that you remember it. And you remember it fairly accurately, is because of dendritic spines. They're structures on the brain that make connections. They're little nodules on the neuron that make connections. And because of the stimuli. Because the stimuli was so different from anything that you'd seen before, your brain will remember it. In a very real way, the other individuals can affect a change in the structure of an individual's brain. So if you have never been to a strip joint before, and all of a sudden you go to a strip joint, and it potentially will change the way that your brain is structured, just by going to the strip joint, if you've never seen that many naked people before. Or go to, wait a minute, let's go someplace else. Nude beach. Okay. I didn't know people look like that. Where did that come from? My sister doesn't look like that. Stimulation will induce neuronal growth. Lack of stimulation will retard neuronal growth. And this is one of the reasons why television has made us smarter. Television has made us smarter because we watch it all the time. There's something different on television all the time. Back in the early 1950s, television was brand new in the 50s. It started around the end of World War II. New York City had television in the late 40s, and then the whole country had television in the early 50s. And because of that, all of a sudden, before people were listening to the radio, and they're listening to all these radio programs, but then all of a sudden they were watching television. And seeing something is a lot different than just listening to somebody describe something. You potentially would see things that they wouldn't have described before. So everything changed. So people became a lot smarter after television. They were afraid that television would really mess things up, that television would change the United States more negatively. And the reality is it didn't, because people were seeing things they had never seen before. Somebody who hadn't gone off to war, stayed home and worked in a factory, that individual had never seen anything except their hometown. Now all of a sudden we could see Paris on television, we could actually see Paris on television, unless you looked it up in a book, and of course then you're just seeing the Eiffel Tower, you're seeing the Arc de Triomphe. But potentially now we could see people walking around Paris, we could see Crève Coeur, we could see all kinds of things in Paris because of television. So that changed a lot of things. People became a lot more global, and that it stimulated their brains. So the kids coming out of the early days of television were really fairly bright if they watched the right television shows. One of the things that happened in my hometown was that when I went to school in 1954, they tested us. They tested our IQ, and they found out that 18 of us were geniuses. Now you wouldn't think that would be too big a deal, except there were only 72 people in my first grade class. That's a huge percentage. That was way out of whack. No one could figure out why there were so many really bright kids in this rural. It was a farming school, and that just didn't make any sense to anybody. So they kept testing us. They tested us year after year after year after year, trying to determine why it was that we had so many really smart kids. These are all farm kids. They were all factory workers' children. It was a real oddity, but the reality was because television was brand new, and we were watching a lot of television. And because the television back then wasn't all cartoons, as a matter of fact, it wasn't any cartoons. It was mostly whatever they had, and the films that they had were educational films. So they showed these all the time, and here the kids in my class, the ones that watched a lot of television, were the ones that were the geniuses, as it turned out. Oh, I went the wrong way again. Okay. Researchers have been able to induce the brains of human subjects to be more active by suggesting to select individuals that water that they would be dipping their hands in would be hot. So they're activating the brain. They're just making a suggestion that the water will be hot. So when they touch the water, they think it's hot, but the reality is it may be tepid or it may be cold. Subjects who did not experience the suggestion had less active brain activity and reported less discomfort from the water. So we can actually activate the brain by telling you something's going to happen. This is the way advertisements work these days. Advertisements work by telling you, they suggest to you that something's going to happen, that your brain is going to change, that your life is going to change. And this, of course, activates your brain. Some people believe everything that they're told. Other people don't. My wife does. She'll buy anything, as dumb as that is. But she didn't watch a lot of television as a child. My family did. We watched lots and lots of television. Wait a minute, let me go back. We watched lots and lots of television. And so we learned not to be fooled by what we saw on television. Copy. Oh, geez, I'll wear my glasses, shouldn't I? Let's see if this works. This may not work. It's working so far. It's a movie. It's a cartoon. You guys like cartoons. All right. Is it coming up? Yeah, it's coming Stop talking.
We each view ourselves as a unique and independent individual. bodies. And no two bodies are the same. Each is a different habitat for microbial communities, from the arid deserts of our skin to the villages on our lips and the cities in our mouths. Even every tooth is its own distinctive neighborhood. And our guts are teeming metropolises of interacting microbes. And in these bustling streets of our guts, we see a constant influx of food, and every microbe has a job to do. Here's a cellulitic bacteria, for example. Their one job is to break down cellulose, a common compound in vegetables, into sugars. Those simple sugars then move along to the respirators, another set of microbes that snatch up these simple sugars and burn them as fuel. As food travels through our digestive tract, it reaches the fermenters who extract energy from these sugars by converting them into chemicals like alcohol and hydrogen gas, which they spew out as waste products. Deeper in the depths of our gut city, the centros eke out a living off the fermenters' trash. At each step of this process, energy is released, and that energy is absorbed by the cells of the digestive tract. This city we just saw is different in everyone. Every person has a unique and diverse community of gut microbes that can process food in different ways. One person's gut microbes may be capable of releasing only a fraction of the calories that another person's gut microbes can extract. So what determines the membership of our gut microbial community? Well, things like our genetic makeup and the microbes we encounter throughout our lives can contribute to our microbial ecosystems. The food we eat also influences which microbes live in our gut. For example, food made of complex molecules like an apple requires a lot of different microbial workers to break it down. But if the food is made of simple molecules like a lollipop, some of these workers are put out of a job. Those workers leave the city, never to return. What doesn't function well are gut microbial communities with only a few different types of workers. For example, humans who suffer from diseases like diabetes or chronic gut inflammation typically have less microbial variety in their guts. We don't fully understand the best way to manage our individual microbial societies, but it is likely that lifestyle changes, such as eating a varied diet of complex plant-based foods, can help revitalize our microbial ecosystems in our gut and across the entire landscape of our body. So we are really not alone in our body. Our bodies are homes to millions of different microbes, and we need them just as much as they need us. As we learn more about how our microbes interact with each other and with our bodies, we will reveal how we can nurture this complex and visible world that shapes our personal identity, our health, and our well-being.
Yay. Okay. That's an answer to a question on your test, too. Come on, pick it up. There we go. Okay. Okay, so let's say that we go someplace like Iraq, Afghanistan, or Vietnam, or wherever the hell you want to go. Yeah, there you go. And we start eating MREs instead of eating, I don't know, whatever you eat around here. For one thing, you can't eat the vegetables out there because some of them are contaminated. When we were in Germany, we couldn't eat the vegetables because it was contaminated with tuberculosis. I know it was endemic in that part of the world. So one of the things that we had to do was we had to soak our vegetables in Clorox. When my wife was in Korea, tuberculosis is also endemic in Korea. They couldn't drink the water because it was contaminated, so they had to run it through a charcoal filter. Anytime you go to a different environment and you try to eat on the economy, a lot of times what happens is you pick up new microbes, and sometimes they're not good microbes. This is one of the reasons why if you go to Mexico and eat on the economy, if you eat their food, then a lot of times you'll develop dysentery. You'll pick up bacteria that they don't have any trouble with because their bodies are used to having being around these microbes, so they kill them. But our bodies aren't, so we start suffering from diarrhea. It's called Montezuma's revenge, as much fun as that is. But I mean, you can go anywhere, and when we were in Vietnam, if you went to Vietnam, after 2 or 3 days, you developed a case of diarrhea, which I won't tell you what they called it, but it was not a pleasant name. And it wasn't a pleasant condition. I don't know if you guys had the same problem. You weren't eating their food, you were eating your own
Well,
food.
before we got to theater,
Yeah.
they would give us pills,
Oh,
but a lot of my soldiers had nightmares from the pills. So just don't take it. It's what's what you eat. We stuck to MREs. That's it.
MREs tend to have a lot of sodium in them, and it really changes things. So that can be a problem. It's a problem traveling between here and Iowa. Iowa is very green, it's very humid, it's very dry here. I've noticed that I am drinking a lot more here than I drink up in Iowa. It's because in Iowa, all you have to do is breathe and you get moisture, but down here, there's no moisture. I mean, especially now. I mean, you haven't had rain for, 2 or 3 weeks. So it's really dry out there. Now, that doesn't bother you guys because you're used to this. This is the environment that you live in. But as far as I'm concerned, now my body has to adapt. And potentially it has to adapt as far as the bacteria in my gut are concerned. So this should be interesting. Well, it's not that interesting to watch because usually your reaction is diarrhea, which is the most fun thing in the whole wide world. So let's pretend that that's not happening. Let's just pretend, okay. Many times psychological research shows a plan of reductionism. This is the way medicine works. We see a problem, and we have to figure out where that problem comes from. So we start out with the problem, and then we follow it to the individual. Then in the individual, we figure out what organ system is being affected. Once we find out what organ system is being affected, we have to determine how that organ system is reacting to whatever the stimulation is. And then we take it down as far as we possibly can. This is what we had to do with a lot of the diseases, with a lot of the mental illnesses. We have to take it down to its basic source to find out how to treat it. One of the problems that we have is a lot of times we just treat symptoms. We're not really treating the root cause of the problem. But that's what we have to do. And this is a process known as reductionism. So we have to reduce, we have to go down to its basic source. But finding the basic source is sometimes not very easy. Once upon a time, back in the late 70s, we started seeing people dying from a disease that we had rarely seen before. Only bubble boys had this problem. We're talking about pneumocystis pneumonia and Kaposi sarcoma. We never saw this in anybody except people whose immune system had completely broken down. And all of a sudden we saw it in a select population, and this population was gay males. And we didn't know what was going on. It was killing them. It was killing them at a really amazing rate. But we didn't know what it was. We didn't know what was killing them. And of course, the crazy evangelist came out and said they're being punished for being gay, as stupid as that sounds. But we had to figure this out because we had lots and lots of people dying. We had lots of people dying in New York City, in the bathhouses in New York. We had people dying in San Francisco, in the bathhouses of San Francisco. We had people dying in gay communities all over the country. Now we have to figure out what's going on. We have to stop this because it looks like it's affecting a lot of people. Now, unfortunately, in the United States, of course, this was going on all over the world, but in the United States, we didn't care. I know, it's tragic. We didn't care. We didn't do anything about it. We didn't gear up the scientific community to figure out what was going on, because there were a lot of people in Congress who were going, they're being punished for their homosexuality. And then it started getting into the heterosexual community. Now we care. All of a sudden we care. Not only that, but the French were going, hey, come on, let's get real. But of course, the President of the United States at the time was Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan's base was relatively conservative. And because of that, he refused to do anything. And he refused to do anything until Rock Hudson died of AIDS. At the time, we didn't really have a name for it. In the beginning, we didn't have a name for it. I was working in the lab at the time, and I was living in Omaha. I was working in Omaha. And Omaha doesn't have a very large gay community. It has a very tiny gay community, actually. Lincoln has a large gay community. But Omaha doesn't, so Omaha didn't care. We had select patients coming in who were suffering from this. And we didn't know anything about it. We didn't know if it was a bacteria. We didn't know if it was a virus. We had no idea what was going on. We didn't know how it was transmitted. So we had to figure all that out. And we did that through reductionism. We saw it in the gay community, so we started there. So only gay individuals are dying. They're dying of an immune system. Their immune systems are breaking down. What's going to happen next? So we broke it down until we finally figured out what was going on. At the same time, scientists around the world were working on it. The French were the first ones to make a breakthrough. They found out that it was a virus, or a retrovirus. It's actually a virus of a virus. And then eventually we figured out that it was a virus that was infecting the T cells, one of the parts of the immune system. Before that, we didn't even know that much about the immune system. We hadn't even broken all the white cells down. But now all of a sudden, of course, because we were doing all this research and trying to reduce it down to its basic source, eventually we figured out what was going on. Now the problem was that we couldn't tell who had AIDS and who didn't have AIDS until they developed full-blown AIDS. So we needed to develop a test so that we could test people. Why is this important? Because if you give blood, if all three of you guys give blood, and one of you has AIDS, we have no way of knowing if there's AIDS in that blood. So we may be giving people contaminated blood. And this is one of the things that was happening. We had all these people with hemophilia. And hemophilia, they take a unit of blood, they pull out all of the platelets. They reduce it down and pull in all these platelets, but it takes 100 different units of blood to make that one packet of platelets. And if one of those, and of course it's in the white cells. AIDS is in the white cells. And so this kid's getting a concentrated shot of AIDS, unfortunately. And we had all these hemophiliacs that were dying. So here, we're discovering all of these wonderful things. We are discovering things because we had to reduce it down to its basic source. That's how we had to follow it. And this is known as reductionism, taking it down to its basic source. We did the same thing with depression. We didn't know where depression came from. Depression back in the 18th century, people suffered from depression just like they do now, but we had no clue. We had no clue where it started because we didn't understand neurons. We didn't understand any of this stuff. So eventually we figured it out by giving people medication that actually worked. And then we tried to figure out how it affected all of these neurons. So that's the way reductionism works. That's the way science works. Science starts out with a problem, the Ebola virus. The Ebola virus didn't start out as the Ebola virus. It started out as a bleeding disease that we had to figure out why these individuals were reacting the way that they were. Ebola, you develop Ebola, the symptoms of Ebola, and like 3 days later, you're bleeding from your eyeballs. You're bleeding from every orifice. It's coming out of your nose, it's coming out of your ears, and you bleed to death. All of your organs hemorrhage, and you die. It's an ugly, ugly disease. But we couldn't figure out what was going on until we found the Ebola virus. And how did we do that? Through reductionism, unfortunately. And Ebola, of course, is highly contagious. If you come in contact with any of the body fluid, then potentially you're contaminated. and this is a really serious problem. We just found it in the Congo. They've got an Ebola outbreak in the Congo, and of course we're trying to contain it. Okay. So what are we doing here? The researchers begin with the general behavior, and as I told you about AIDS, looking at response in the brain, they locate the area of the brain that is affected. From the affected area, they isolate the single nerves that are affected. They then will look at the chemical changes that take place in the neuron, and of course you're trying to reduce it down to its basic level so that we can change things, so that we can help people, hopefully. Using the technique of reductionism, researchers can break down the complex mechanism that leads to brain malfunctions. Here's an answer to a question on the quiz. About 19% of all Americans suffer from some form of psychiatric disorder. That's 1 out of every 5. There's 4 of us in the room, so we're all safe. It's that 5th guy coming in the door. And you know, Johnny almost came in the door. Johnny Villa? You know Johnny? Okay.
Yeah.
He would have been the guy. He would have been the guy. Okay. We're all safe as long until Johnny comes in, and then who knows what's happening next. The president is claiming that it's not guns, it's the men behind the guns that are causing the problems. We need to isolate all these individuals and take their weapons away from them. I don't know if that's possible or not. But anyway, we have 19% of the people in the United States, 1 out of every 5. Another 3.2% suffer from some neurological disorder. The neurological disorder that is increasing at the highest rate is Alzheimer's disease. Any idea why Alzheimer's disease suddenly is on the rise? What the hell's going on? For a while we thought that Alzheimer's disease was caused by aluminum pans. We were cooking in aluminum pans. Yeah, it was contaminating the brain. And it was clogging up things in your brain. And people who used aluminum pans, cooked in aluminum pans, were developing Alzheimer's disease at a higher rate. Turned out that was incorrect. So what's going on? Why is Alzheimer's increasing around the world? Not just here, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. Doesn't seem to be bad in the Kalahari Desert, where they're mostly hunter-gatherers. Those guys don't have a problem with Alzheimer's disease. What's happening? We found Alzheimer's disease when we first came to the Americas. And the reason was because, well, so what's going on? Why more now than before? 10 years ago, we didn't have this much Alzheimer's disease.
Who's it named after?
A guy by the name of Alzheimer, yeah.
Sounds German.
A German doctor. That's who it's named after. I can't remember his first name. What's going on now? This was back in he named it in the 19th century. He started seeing people with this progressive form of dementia. I had a friend whose father suffered from early onset Alzheimer's disease. The guy was a engineer, and he developed transmissions. He worked at Warner. He worked for Borg Warner, and he developed transmissions. So if you drive an automatic car, you can thank my friend's father for that. But he started suffering from Alzheimer's disease in his 40s, and by his 50s he was dead. My friend was afraid that it was genetic and he inherited it, so he decided not to have any children.
Isn't there a movie about it that she found out that she had early onset Alzheimer's, and her kids got tested for it, and she also, they believed it was passed on through genetics as well?
I haven't seen the movie yet.
I think it was called Still Alice with Julianne Moore in it.
I don't know. Okay, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't seen the movie.
But yeah, and her children got tested, and out of the 2 children, one of her kids had early onset Alzheimer's. They found that.
In his case, neither of them had early onset, evidently, because my friend's, he's older than I am, he's 70. He's actually 70. I'll be 70 in October. So he's still alive and he's still fairly lucid. As lucid as you can be when you're 70 years old. He was an elementary school teacher and he was a principal at an elementary school. But he retired in his 50s because his wife is wealthy. His wife is from a wealthy family, so they go to Aruba every winter, you know, stupid stuff like that. They own lots of horses. They kayak around the world. They're just playing now. But then again, he thought he would be dead by the time he was in his 60s, so. So they spent all their money. You know, you gotta spend all your money. You don't want to die with all your money. He doesn't have anybody to give it to. Actually, he does. He's got nieces and nephews from his sister, who thought she had it too, so she was afraid to have the kids. But none of the grandkids have it either. So why Alzheimer's? Why is Alzheimer's increasing? Is it all the pollution in the United States? Is it those damn cell phones? They're affecting your brain? Is that it? We're living longer. And almost everybody who is in their 80s and 90s has some degree of Alzheimer's disease, as it turns out. So we're living longer than we ever have before. So we're increasing the number of people with Alzheimer's disease. If we want to reduce the number of people with Alzheimer's disease, we have to die younger. But I don't think anybody's going to volunteer to do that. I'm guessing nobody's going to volunteer to do that. I won't. I'm already too old anyway. I already screwed everything up. Skewed everything up. So if we look at psychiatric disorders, and this is an answer to a question on your test as well, which psychiatric disorder is the most prevalent? Well, as we can see, 16 million Americans suffer from severe anxiety. And second is alcohol and drug abuse, 15 million, 16 million. Severe depression is only at 10 million, which isn't that high. And as you can see, schizophrenia is tiny. It's only 1.5%. Our 1,500,000 people suffer from schizophrenia. If we look at Alzheimer's disease, 3 million people in the United States suffer from Alzheimer's disease. And the rest of them are relatively small. Epilepsy, 2 million people, epilepsy certainly doesn't kill you. Stroke will kill you, of course. 1.8 million people have stroke or have suffered from a cerebrovascular accident. 3 million people have Alzheimer's disease, but it's a relatively small percentage of the population. It's less than 1%. Of the people in the United States, we have over 300 million people. In the United States, we're the fourth most populous country in the world. Much of the research dealing with psychology is done on other species. By comparing reactions of other species, researchers are able to judge how humans will react in similar situations. We're not allowed to do research on babies, for example. Human babies can't do that. When we were thinking, before we shot people up into space, we had to try to determine what would happen to them if there was a problem. And we used beagles, as weird as that may sound. And I already told you the story of my friend who was the individual that euthanized the beagles after they tortured them, after they did something to them. And he was a guy from Laguna. In the old days, we used to do a lot of primate research. People had monkey labs or chimpanzee labs. And of course, chimpanzees are very expensive, so are monkeys are relatively expensive. But something that we don't have that aren't very expensive are lab rats. And of course, 93%, and now we have 93% of all animals used in research are rodents. So there is a whole branch of psychology where you do research on other animals, mostly with either mice or rats, as god-awful as that sounds. We also do research with pigeons, as strange as that may seem. Anyway, 93% of all research is done on rodents, and that's just a joke. Okay. Why do I put jokes in my lectures? That's terrible. Okay, so we just answered like 5 different questions. on your quiz, which is and a lot of people took the quiz, some people didn't do very well. And the reason is because this stuff may not be in your text. It was in an earlier text, but of course, it's in my lecture, as interesting as that is. So you need to listen to the lectures, and you also need to read your textbook in order to get the answers to the questions on the quiz. And that's the end of this chapter. All right. Now we'll go to the next chapter. The next chapter talks about neurons. Now the interesting thing about the nervous system is that this is how we treat your problems. This is how we treat your mental illnesses if you have a mental illness.
It's classified as a mental illness.
What's classified as a mental illness?
Skids?
That's a good question. What is a mental illness? A mental illness would be a problem.
It seems like an easy question, but
Exactly. It has to
break it down, it's kind of complex.
It is very complex. It has to do with thought processes, mistaken thought processes, depression, anxiety, antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, schizophrenia. All of these are problems within your brain that potentially we can treat. Well, no, there's some of them we can't treat. So are those mental illnesses? And the answer is, yeah, those are mental illnesses too. Well, let's take an example. Let's take TBIs, for example. Traumatic brain injury. Is that a mental illness? And the answer is no, it's not. Because it comes from outside. If I react to stress in a negative manner, is that a mental illness? And the answer is no, that's not a mental illness. It doesn't come from inside, it comes from outside stimulation. That's where TBI comes in. It's outside stimulation that has caused the problem. The symptoms may be similar. Memory problems, for example. Yeah, the symptoms may be similar. So when we talk about the nervous system, this is really important because this is how we treat a mental illness, not your mental illness. We're all okay in here, but you can assume I'm okay. But I may have Alzheimer's disease. And is that a mental illness? Yeah, it's internal, so it'd be a mental illness. This is how we treat mental illnesses. This is how we treat problems, memory problems. This is how we treat depressions, how we treat anxiety. We have to give you a medication that's going to change a chemical in your brain that will allow you to be more normal than you were before, theoretically, okay? So this stuff is really important. A lot of individuals become counselors and they distribute medications, but they don't understand this stuff, and that's okay, as long as they're treating the client correctly. The nervous system is composed of cells called nerve cells or neurons. The average human has about between 100 billion and 150 billion neurons. You can kill these things. Traumatic brain injury will kill neurons. But you can also kill them with drugs. You can kill them with crystal meth, for example. You can kill them with alcohol. So we're losing neurons all the time. And you can do things that accelerate the death of your neurons in your brain by shooting up with heroin or using crystal meth. When you use crystal meth, if you use crystal meth, it makes you, it excites your brain, it overexcites your brain, it kills some of your neurons. If you stop, it's going to take you about 18 months before you can recover to the point where you are as smart as you were before. This is known as meth head, when you're kind of stupid after 18 months. People that smoke marijuana have kind of the same problem. They have memory problems. Marijuana causes short-term memory problems. And of course, it's not really a situation where it becomes permanent, but it can rearrange the structure of your brain. And in that way, your short-term memory is not as good as it was before. So we've got lots and lots of neurons, and if we just kind of walked around and didn't do anything, then we would be okay. No, not really, because we need to exercise in order to stimulate our brains. Remember all of those dendritic spines that create connections in our brains. These are really very important. And one of those connectors, one of the things that induces all these connectors to be created is exercise. So exercise is really very important, but at the same time, it may potentially destroy some of your cells. Neurons communicate with each other at a point known as a synapse. Another cell that protects and adds structure to the nervous system is the glial cells. And we have just about as many glial cells as we have neurons. The glial cells create structure. The neurons themselves are relatively delicate, and they're protected by all these glial cells. They are the armor around all of the neurons to protect them. And they feed them. They feed the neurons at the same time. A neuron is composed of 4 major parts. The dendrites collect the stimuli or information and transmit it to the rest of the neuron. This is the dendrites. All these little fingers sticking out are the dendrites. The soma, or the cell body, contains the nucleus and serves to maintain the cell. This is the soma. This is the nucleus. It's where the nucleus is. Soma just means body. Okay, and this is a word you'll see a lot in science, especially in biology. They talk about something somatic. When they talk about something as being somatic, they're talking about of the body. It's just a word that means body. So this isn't the only time you'll hear the word soma when we're talking about this nucleus. Soma is very common in biological terms. It's a Latin word that means body. So we've got the dendrites, which are the fingers. We've got the cell body, which is called the soma. The axon is the main transmitting apparatus, and this is the axon right here. The 4th part is the axon terminals. This is the part that gives off the nervous response, whatever it's going to do. If it's stimulating a muscle, it makes the muscle twitch. This is the part that does it down here, the axon terminal. So the dendrite will pick up the information. It'll pass through the soma, down the axon to the axon terminal, and if there's enough stimulation, then it will communicate with whatever it is connected to. As exciting as that is. Neurons can be classified in 3 basic ways. We either classify them by their shape, by their size, or by what they do, by their function. So there's 3 different ways that we can classify neurons. As much fun as that is. Multipolar neurons have many dendrites in a single axon. Most of the neurons of the vertebrate brain are multipolar. So this is the way your brain looks. You'll have one neuron, and it'll have all these dendrites connected to other things. If you're watching a movie and you see something that stimulates your brain and tells you, well, you should remember that, it's because of all these connections in here. The more stimulation you get, remember those dendritic spines we were talking about, all those connectors. All the television that you watched as a child, you probably still remember watching Popeye. I'm sorry. How about they're making a new movie or they're making a new cartoon. Skeletor and Master of the Universe, is that what it was?
He-Man.
What is it?
He-Man.
He-Man, that's it. Yeah, my son used to watch He-Man. Now, see, I can't even remember this stuff. Why in the world are we making all these connectors? Why, when I mentioned Skeletor, did Scott think of He-Man? Because it just made a connection in his brain. He used to watch He-Man as a child, maybe. I don't know if he watched He-Man, okay. Well, my son did. And so all of these connections are being made. The more stimulation you get as a child, the more connections that you have. And that's a good thing. That's one of the reasons why television wasn't so bad. Unfortunately, it's a passive way of getting information, but that's okay, as long as it's information. You guys probably make all these really odd connections because of what you have seen, what you have watched. My grandson went down to Florida. For some reason, they let him watch a movie down there where a guy came into a farmhouse and killed everybody in the farmhouse. I live in a farmhouse, so when he came home, when he came back to Iowa to go to school, he was out at my wife's house, or out at my house, at my farmhouse, and he was scared. And he was scared because those stupid idiots in Florida. I hope they watch this video. My wife wants to go down and punch his grandmother down there because she let him watch that movie. And now he's scared. I mean, he's scared because he saw this movie. Now, logically, he shouldn't have to worry about it. We're out in the middle of Iowa. We're in the middle of a cornfield. There's no lights on. You can't see my house from the road. It's invisible. And we're behind all of these corn stalks. So he's he's probably safer there than he is anyplace else. He's safer there than he would be down in Florida, where it's so damn crowded with all those crazy people down there. He's safer in Iowa. Anyway, he made connections that unfortunately I wish he hadn't made, and now he's scared. He's scared of being out of the farm where it's dark. There's no light. Does light make you safe? Yeah. Yeah, okay. We won't go into that, okay. I can hide in the dark. I can see in the dark. People that need light all the time, they can't see in the dark. They're blinded by the dark. So who's better off, me or them? If somebody came and tried to hurt me at my house, I could see everything. I mean, I could see really well in the dark.
Half of my career was in the dark.
In the dark, exactly. My brother has tunnel vision, and what they used to do is he wouldn't be awake during the day. He'd be asleep during the day and awake at night because they'd send him out on patrols because he can see. The kid is just amazing. His eyes are set into his skull. So he sees really well in the dark, and he used to ambush, groups coming in. Anyway, it's not important. But why are we talking about this? Oh yeah, my poor grandson. Anyway, I can see really well in the dark. He can see better than I can. He used to. And he has this ability to understand shadows. So when he moves, he's like a ninja. When he moves around, you can't see him. It's irritating. Playing games with him at night is hide and seek, because he always wins, or he always won. He doesn't play them anymore. Bipolar neurons have single dendrites at one end and a single axon at the other. Most of the neurons of the sensory system are bipolar, especially those of the retina and the olfactory system. So they look like this. This is the optic nerve of your eyeball. This is what it looks like. It's a bipolar neuron. Your olfactory system is your sense of smell. But if we're looking at your brain looks like, I'm going the wrong direction. This is what your brain looks like, all these connections. And that's why when I said Skeletor, Scott thought of He-Man, because he connected He-Man. And I couldn't remember He-Man's name. It was Masters of the Universe was a cartoon though, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. And it was He-Man versus Skeletor.
Yeah.
Okay. Wasn't there a cat? Didn't he have this?
I don't remember the cat, but then there was She-Ra.
She-Ra. I was thinking there was a lady.
Yeah.
She was a warrior too, wasn't she? Didn't she wear armor?
With He-Man, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. They were romantically involved, though. We don't do that in cartoons. I don't think we do. I don't know. Okay. Josie and the Pussycats. We won't go into Josie and the Pussycats. The movie was on last night. I didn't watch it. Monopolar neurons have a single branch coming off the soma that branches in two different directions. One branch will be the input direction and the other will be the output direction, but there are axons going in both directions. So we have all of these different structures. How important is this? Well, this is really important if we're talking about how your eyeball is stuck together, okay, how you see or how you smell. So most of the sensory organs have bipolar neurons, and that can be very important, especially if somebody has gone blind, can't see anymore. Some neurons are very large and some are very small. Examples of small cells will be granule, spindle, and stellate neurons. Examples of large neurons would be pyramidal, Golgi, and Purkinje neurons, and we'll talk about those later on and how important they are. You've got a neuron that is as long as your leg. It's your sciatic nerve, and it starts up here. If you've ever had sciatic problems, and I tend to have sciatic problems, it runs in my family, it's genetic. It starts at the top of your butt and it runs all the way down to your heel. That's your sciatic nerve. Well, if you have a problem with it, you have it in here because there's a sheath that it is contained in. And sometimes if you move a lot and you move in strange directions, that sheath the neuron will come out of that sheath, or it'll get displaced in that sheath. So what you have to do is you have to stretch that. You have to stretch your gluteus maximus muscles in order to put that back into its sheath. How about that? Okay. So when I run, and I ran yesterday with my damn dogs, I've got a dog that doesn't want to run. He's part yellow lab and he's part Shar-Pei. Shar-Pei are the laziest dogs in the world. And second is the yellow lab. And so he's both of those lazy dogs. And so when we run, sometimes, when he was a puppy, he was okay. Now that he's an adult, if he sees shade, he wants to lay down in it. It's that kind of deal. He's a really sweet dog, but he's lazy.
How old is he?
He's 2.
Oh, man.
I know.
Teenager, man.
So he's going to be this way the rest of his life. But he gets so excited when I put my clothes on to go running. I take him with me, and then now I'm dragging him. I don't run that fast. I mean, I'm an old man. I can't run that fast, but here I am dragging my damn dog. Functionally, neurons either receive stimuli, create a response, or connect the two. Sensory neurons collect the stimulus and pass the message on to the vast network of connector neurons or interneurons. So there are neurons that collect information, there are neurons that stimulate whatever it's supposed to stimulate, and then there are connector neurons, and the connector neurons are called interneurons. It's why it's so difficult to talk about neurons, because some of them are interneurons, some of them collect the information, and some of them stimulate whatever they're supposed to stimulate. Motor neurons connect to the muscles or glands and create a response by making the muscles contract or by changing the activity of the gland. And these, of course, are known as motoneurons. That's what allows you to run. That's what allows you to lift weights. It's what allows you to do whatever it is that you're going to be doing. Neurons do not touch each other. They don't touch each other. This is an answer to a question on your test. They don't ever touch each other. And if they do, they short themselves out. So you don't want them to touch. Between the dendrite of one neuron and the axon of another, across a gap, there is a gap known as a synaptic cleft. That's how they communicate, through this cleft. Now this is a good thing, because now we can change things by changing that chemical, or inducing there to be more of that chemical in there. And this is how we cure people's depression. Serotonin makes you less unhappy. How's that? Okay. So if you are depressed, we can increase your serotonin level in your synaptic cleft. Now your depression has gone away. We fixed your depression. Let's say that you have anxiety issues. Anxiety issues are caused by a low level of GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid. If we can increase your GABA level, then you won't be nearly as anxious as you were before. So we can control your anxiety. We can make you less anxious by giving you a drug that increases your GABA level. Now we just fixed two different problems, your anxiety and your depression. We gave you Xanax, and that took care of your anxiety level. Or it does with some people. Well, it does with some people. At the end of the axon is the axon terminal. The axons end in expanded areas called buttons or boutons. Bouton is, of course, the French word for button, as much fun as that is. Okay, so what happens is the neuron is stimulated. The chemicals are in these buttons, are in these vesicles, and the neurochemical that stimulates the other neuron. And if that is released, then you have chemical in between, and they will go to receptor sites on the other neuron. And now we have a reaction because enough serotonin went across the synaptic cleft, and now we have a reaction, or GABA, or whatever the neurotransmitter may happen to be. The first neurotransmitter that we discovered was acetylcholine. Acetylcholine allows you to move. It makes your muscles move. Acetylcholine also allows you to remember things. Okay, so as long as acetylcholine is in here, as long as we can stimulate acetylcholine, you'll remember things. Now, one of the problems with Alzheimer's disease is the portion of your brain that produces acetylcholine dies. It starts to die. And you're not producing enough acetylcholine. But we can slow down Alzheimer's disease by giving you a drug that stimulates more acetylcholine manufacturing to be done.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what happens with all this, with the TBI?
Right. What happens with the TBI?
Yeah.
Well, you've got brain destruction. Okay. You have, and we don't know what portion of your brain is being affected. When you think, and this is an answer to a question from the other quiz, you use 100% of your brain. Okay, so we're stimulating your brain. So part of your brain has been damaged, like with a stroke. A TBI is very similar to a stroke. Something has happened and it's killed a portion of your brain. If the wrong portion of your brain was destroyed, now we've got all kinds of mood changes. We have memory problems, potentially. So what we have to do is we have to accentuate the portion of your brain that induces memory. If you have depression, we need to stimulate the portion of your brain that produces serotonin, so that, or norepinephrine. If you have, some people get TBI and they lose their mojo, they lose their desire to, they don't think that they can do anything. And that's because of the norepinephrine level has gone down. Okay. So what we have to do is we have to accentuate that portion of your brain that makes you normal again, makes you feel like you're normal again. It isn't the problem that you're not normal, the problem is that you don't feel normal, because this has happened in your brain. Okay? So if you have brain damage to any extent at all, you can get brain damage from a lot of different things. Football causes brain damage, all that head knocking that takes place. Soccer, because you head the ball in soccer, can cause brain damage. Can cause brain damage to some extent. So what we have to do is we have to make you feel like you're normal again. And the way we do that is by stimulating other portions of your brain. We overstimulate portions of your brain. Okay. Yeah. And it all depends on where the damage is. I think in one of your postings you talked about damage, and I told you about my friend that was in the bicycle race. He was riding his bicycle, and he became and he rammed his head into a hood ornament on a vehicle. And he lost like 15% of his brain or something. Anyway, he recovered, and he was a normal guy. The only problem was his personality had changed. Before, he was real aggressive. Jeez, there was something wrong with this guy. He could seduce anybody. It was just ridiculous. And he did all kinds of horrible things. He was not a very nice person. So once he had his brain damage, he became a nice guy. And he stopped trying to seduce everybody, as strange as that was. So it actually fixed him. It actually fixed him, but he started, there were some things that he did the same way he did them before, because, well, it's memory. So he would wear not very many clothes. Now before, when he was a seductive monster, nobody cared if he was, half naked. But now that he was not, women stopped reacting to him. They started reacting to him differently. It was the oddest thing you've ever seen. So they accused him of sexual harassment. And the reality was, they should have charged the other guy for sexual harassment, not the new guy. Because he wasn't even harassing anybody anymore, but he was dressing provocatively, and they considered that. It's a really weird situation. He ended up going to Montana and living an isolated life up in Montana. As weird as that is. I knew him in Omaha. Anyway, the end of the axon is known as a presynaptic zone. The area of the receiving dendrite is known as the postsynaptic zone. So the presynaptic zone is where the chemicals come from. Where they are received is the postsynaptic zone, where they are received by the other neuron. The message is actually transported by a chemical known as a neurotransmitter that is contained in spheres, the axons called the synaptic vesicles. These are the synaptic vesicles right here. They are full of chemicals. And as soon as this neuron is stimulated, they will release the chemical, and it will cross the synaptic cleft. And it will attach itself to receptor sites. Now this is really, really important, because this is how the pharmaceuticals that we use to treat you, this is how they work. We block something so that it either doesn't allow the vesicle to release it, or it keeps it from being destroyed in the synaptic cleft. So it increases the amount of that drug in there, that neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine, serotonin, GABA, whatever it is that we're dealing with. And this is how they work. And this is why this is really important, because this is how the pharmaceuticals work. Now the problem is that sometimes we'll give you a drug, we'll give you a medication that interferes with this whole process, but you're already taking a medication that interferes with that process as well. So now we get an overreaction, or no reaction at all. The two drugs cancel each other out. So you're taking aspirin, and we think that we're giving you a drug that's going to make you less depressed, but the aspirin is interfering with the medication that we're giving you. And for that reason, of course, your depression doesn't go away. I'm a really weird guy. I can't take ibuprofen. Yeah, I know, Scott.
Get the ibuprofen. You're in the military?
I cannot take ibuprofen. If I take ibuprofen, I get depressed. Okay. Yeah, I know, it's really weird. I'm a really happy guy almost all the time. But if I take ibuprofen, I get depressed. Now, why is that? Why is 89% of the population able to take this medication, and if I take it, I get depressed? The reality is that 11% of the population react this way. Most of those people that react this way don't realize that that's what's happening. They're taking ibuprofen and they're getting depressed. So they take ibuprofen because they've got a bad knee, and they take it every day, and all of a sudden they're depressed. So they go to the doctor, they say, I'm depressed. The doctor says, oh, okay, so you're suffering from depression. We'll give you Prozac. Now they're taking Prozac, they're taking ibuprofen, which is causing them to be depressed, and now they're taking an antidepressant on top of that. And the antidepressant doesn't work very well. Whoops. So these are things that we need to think about. There potentially can be a reaction between chemicals. You may have a biochemical structure in your brain that doesn't allow you to do something. I can't take ibuprofen. If I drink caffeine, I could drink one of those 5-hour energy, what is that? That little bitty thing, tastes like crap. 5-hour energy.
Those little shot things.
Yeah, little shots of pure caffeine. It doesn't affect me at all. It doesn't do anything to me. Other individuals take that and they get heart palpitations. My dad used to drink pot after pot of coffee. Didn't affect him at all. My mom would drink half a cup of coffee and she'd have a reaction in her heart. Her heart would start palpating. And as she got older, and she made it to 97, as she got older, it became more and more extreme. So she couldn't even smell coffee, or she would have a reaction. As stupid as that sounds. So we all have different biochemical structures, and we need to recognize that. Just because 85% of the population can take this drug doesn't mean that you're one of those 85%. You may be one of the 15%. Or, as with ibuprofen, 11% of the population has a negative reaction. In cold capsules, they have a chemical called pseudoephedrine. Pseudoephedrine works on 13% of the population, but they put this stuff in all, they put this stuff in all of the cold capsules, despite the fact that it only works on 13%. On those 13%, if they take those cold capsules, their symptoms go away. But in 87%, it doesn't work at all. But it's still in there, as stupid as that sounds. Okay, so pharmaceutical companies are trying to hit as many people as they possibly can. But they understand that it doesn't always work. Opiates and opioids do not work on me, which is bad when I'm having surgery because they try to hit you with morphine. The only way they knock you out is with opiates and opioids. Fentanyl works because it's like 100 times stronger than anything else. And of course, eventually, portions of my brain do go to sleep. But I've awakened in surgery 3 times, damn it, because you can't convince doctors that you're not average. As stupid as that sounds. You work in medicine, you understand how dumb these guys are.
Yeah.
They want everybody to be exactly the same, but that's not true. Okay, so we have to understand that everybody's brain is different. And when we're treating somebody and we throw Prozac at them, it's only going to work on 75% of the population. 25% is not going to touch it. It's not going to make them less happy. But we have what we call the placebo effect. Placebo effect is wonderful because I can give you an aspirin. If you've got a headache, I can give you an aspirin and your headache goes away right away, despite the fact it's still a solid pill in your stomach and it hasn't dissolved whatsoever. It has gone away because your brain thinks that it's going to go away, so your headache goes away. Usually headaches are tension headaches. All you have to do is relieve the tension and it's gone. Let me see what time it is. Okay. One of the interesting areas of study dealing with neuron projections comes from the dendrites called the spines, and we talked about the spines before. These are the connections that are created to allow you to remember things right away. If we can stimulate your brain, if we can excite your brain, then you'll remember everything that I say. If you get really into this lecture and you start laughing and you start crying and you start reacting emotionally to this lecture, you'll remember every word that I say. And that's because of dendritic spines. We can induce these things with adrenaline. We can induce these things with emotion. if we can induce emotion, so if I can make you laugh, then you're more likely to remember things. If I can make you cry, I don't know if I can do that. I'd hate to have to step on everybody's toes to make them cry. These spines seem to change with experience and have been known to change within seconds when the individual is exposed to a novel stimuli or a stimulus. It's gorgeous around here, but you guys probably don't know how gorgeous it is because you're overstimulated. You've been here all your life. It's just normal. All these tall red rocks, you don't really give them up. That was over at my house, one of those kind of deals. But if you went to Iowa and saw all the cornfields, this is novel stimulation. You've never seen that much green before. So you'd remember and you'd think of Iowa as this huge cornfield, which it's not really. Okay. Novel stimulus. So we need to, and there you go. These are the dendritic spines that we're talking about. These little lumps. And they make connections. And as long as we can make connections, we're good to go. So if you're in a really scary situation like combat, you remember everything. And everything slows down because all of a sudden you're remembering everything. When you're in that situation, because you're reacting so rapidly to things that it's almost like everything slows down. And at the same time, it speeds up.
Take the Matrix.
I'm sorry?
Take the Matrix.
I'm sorry.
The Matrix, the movie.
Yeah, like the Matrix movie. Exactly. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation. It's a horrible situation to be in. But it does. Everything speeds up and everything slows down at the same time. Yes, sir?
How long does it take for these to form?
Nanoseconds. They form almost instantaneously with memory if you need to remember something. And that's one of the reasons why you don't forget things, what happens to you. All the bad stuff. And all the good stuff. Hopefully all the good stuff. There are individuals that only remember bad things. There are individuals that only remember good things. That's me.
It's basically anything that you consider memorable, and
Adrenaline. It has to do with adrenaline. It increases the number of spines that are being created. I know, it's not so nearly as much fun if you think of it as dendritic spines induced by adrenaline, but that's the reality. That's why you remember. That's why you remember certain birthdays, you remember certain birthday presents, you remember certain events, which are seemingly everyday events, but for some reason they're stuck in your brain. I mean, can you remember what happened on October 3rd when you were in the 3rd grade? No, hell no. Nothing happened, right? I don't know, maybe you got tripped on the playground. But if you had a fight with somebody when you were in the 4th grade, you remember that. You remember that like it happened yesterday afternoon. You can remember who it was, you can remember if you got punched. You can remember a lot of different things. When I was in elementary school, no, I was in junior high. I think it was about the 5th grade. For some reason, the most popular girl in our class decided that she wanted to take the pants off of one of the kids in the class. So she got all the boys to chase this kid down and take his pants off. The famous de-pantsing of Gary Hess. Now, I used to play on the playground all the time. I wasn't part of it because I wasn't a popular kid, and I wasn't one of the people that she tried to talk into taking Gary Hess's pants off. But it happened, and I remember seeing it, and I remember trying to get involved in stopping them from doing that. I remember doing that. They all got paddled. The famous de-pantsing of Gary Hess. You can imagine how embarrassed poor Gary was running around in his underwear. You know, you weren't supposed to see somebody's underwear. But I remember that. I mean, I played on the playground every day, twice, sometimes 3 times a day. But I remember the de-pantsing of Gary Hess like it happened yesterday afternoon. Why? Because of all the adrenaline. and because of all the paddlings afterwards, as weird as that is. And they couldn't figure out how to paddle her. That was, I mean, normally they didn't paddle girls, but she was the one that talked them into it. There was something wrong with that lady. She became the head cheerleader eventually. She had red hair, not that that's important. And she decided she wanted to take Gary Hess's pants off. And so they had to paddle her, but they couldn't figure out how to do it. That was kind of interesting. Everybody else got paddled out in front of us, but not Barbara. I know, the famous de-pantsing of Gary Hess, which it became known as the famous de-pantsing of Gary Hess. The axon projects from the soma in an expanded area known as the axon hillock, and this is the axon hillock right here. The electrical impulse begins in the widened hillock and intensifies as it moves into the narrower axon proper. So it moves from here all the way down to the terminal, and that's when it releases, that's when it forces the release of the neurotransmitter from the vesicles. But it starts here in the hillock. That's where the electrical impulse starts. So it's an electrochemical reaction. The electrical charge moves down to the neuron, or the vesicles, and the vesicles release the chemical. It's electrochemical. It's a electrochemical reaction. Almost all neurons have only one axon. However, some have axons that divide and form several branches. This branching is known as axon collaterals, and the collaterals become very important. Some individuals have more collaterals than others. Females have more collaterals than males do. Males are hardwired, and for this reason, if a woman has a brain injury, she will recover more readily from the brain injury than the male will. This is one of the things we've discovered with strokes. Females who have a stroke recover more readily than males do. As sad as that is.
Has there been any research with on this with hermaphrodites?
Hermaphrodites. No, there aren't that many hermaphrodites. And what we have determined from looking at people who are considered to be hermaphrodites, or to be both male and female, is that they were born biologically as one or the other. The male brain is created in the womb. The female brain is created in the womb. But of course, this is a reaction to society. Society tells us whether we're male or female, tells us what we're supposed to be. So your brain is structured as either a male brain or a female brain.
So it'll just depend on which way they're structured?
Exactly. Whether the baby was born as a male or a female.
Okay.
Okay. Biologically, they are a female, they'll have one structure of the brain. If they're male, they'll have another structure.
What's that part that connects them left and right side of the brain?
Corpus callosum.
I
And it's bigger in females.
was just gonna say,
It's
I
bigger
read
in
it was
females.
bigger in females, which allows them to multitask a little easier.
Exactly. Exactly. It also allows them to recover from these things much more readily. Unfortunately, it's not fair. They're protected with estrogen. They've got more flexible brains. You know, they're supposed to survive, and the reason they're supposed to survive is because they equal children. Males don't equal anything. We're like drones. You know.
Barker ants.
One guy can impregnate all the women, and then, you know, so what are the other guys gonna do? Well, let's send them out and get them killed or something. We'll start wars and shoot them all, or something, I don't know. Stab them, chop their heads off, I don't know. Maybe we'll feed them to the females, that's the way praying mantises, do. Why don't we stop right here, and we'll pick this up next time. As much fun as this is, and I'll stop picking on males and stop being nice to females. Well.